So, the steppes. Remember the steppes? Spreading across from Europe to Asia, filled with people running around on horses, shooting bows, and generally causing unrest amongst their neighbours, particularly the neighbours at each end. There's a lot of desert in the middle, not a lot of neighbours, just trees up here, but over here and over here we have neighbours. And so in China and also in Europe, they came up with ways of countering these annoying people with their bows and also with their horses, of course. And if you remember, in China, they adopted or developed or invented the stirrup in order to be able to run around it as well as people born to the steppes had done. Well, archery was another thing. And for that, this rather creepy photograph is a good example of why crossbows are easy to shoot. So if you can see this young lady who has gone to some Ren fair or other medieval reenactment thing is using a crossbow. You see, so she's using this crossbow, and you can see how very easy it is to look down the bolt. This is what an arrow on a crossbow is called, a bolt. Look down the bolt towards the target. It's not like a hand bow, a normal bow, in which you have that problem of not being able to see what you're shooting at because the bow is actually in the way. You're looking straight down the arrow. You're pointing it and shooting it. In fact, this rather creepy chap behind is actually looking correctly. See, he's looking directly along the line of that bolt, or she's sort of looking down on it, so that's not quite right. So you look along it and boing. And I'm sure any one of you, if you were in, if we did some archery and did some crossbow shooting, you could each hit the target with a crossbow, whereas with a bow, especially if you've never done it before, and some students will have had some exposure to bows at camps and things like that, but those who have not will often do things. I used to have students trying archery out when I had smaller classes, and there would always be at least one person that managed to shoot the bow rather than the arrow. No, really, they would end up with holding the arrow and the bow would go skittering across the floor. But with a crossbow, there'd be no problem. Point and shoot. Boom. So crossbows were a good idea if you don't want to spend all that time learning how to shoot a bow. So here is China. It's a map of China. All these people not getting along. And in that environment, the crossbow was invented. This is an early working. You can see you're mostly looking at the trigger here. This would be in a large, wooden stock. And this is a slightly later version with this bronze mounting mechanism. And so you can see what you're looking at is where the string would come back and would be here behind this. And this is the trigger. This is to cock the trigger, okay? And so the rest of it, of course, is missing. Although at the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, where the terracotta army came from, there were actually crossbows. And so we can see, it's a bit later, just a couple of hundred years later, and so we can see exactly what Chinese crossbows look like, lots of illustrations, lots of excellent stuff. And so we know a lot about crossbows in China. In the West, it's less reliable, really. We have absolutely no archaeological remains that I'm aware of, and we only have basically references to these things called gastrophetes, in which you this would go on your stomach. You put your hands here, and you lean into this device, and this piece of wood here pushes the locking mechanism up here, and then you could lock it. and then you put the arrow, the bolt rather, on here and shoot it. So that's a Gastrophetes, and what we know about that is sort of like hypothesizing how far back it went, based on people writing about larger devices a bit later on. So this is to do, remember I was telling you in an early lecture about the Greeks and how they went around the Mediterranean creating colonies, starting off here, pottering around in boats, and then pottering around in boats all over the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. One of these places was Syracuse. Syracuse in Sicily here, in Italy, and a very important citizen of Syracuse was Dionysius I, tyrant of Syracuse. And a tyrant used to be just like a leader that sort of like decided he was going to be in charge. And the actual bad press that tyrants get was largely due to Dionysus, who was a bit of a twat. A despot, probably more accurate term. And he was running things for quite a long time, between 405 and 367 BC. And this is one of the very nice silver coins that was minted about that time. We do have coins definitely minted by him, but this is kind of cool. It's actually at the ROM, and Charles Corelli, the former director of the ROM, used to go around with this in his pocket all the time, so it's a bit more worn than it would have otherwise been. But it's a beautiful, heavy silver coin, and he liked to just hold on to it. Anyway, from Dionysus to Charles Corelli, Dionysus was very interested in building an empire. He tried to get the Carthaginians, Carthage is over here, out of Sicily, and he invaded Italy and messed around in Greece. Syracuse is probably the most powerful Greek city at this time, although it's now in Italy, but this is part of the Greek colonies. And what he got into in a big way was things like architecture. He did massive city walls around Syracuse, but also ships. And on those ships were siege engines. This is actually a Roman ship, but it gives you an idea. So basically, remember the ships I was talking to you about with the rowing. Of course, this one has no oars, but you know what I mean. And a lot of ramming. But another thing they did, they would have things on, and that's what these are actually. These are being used to throw darts or stones at another ship. It's another way that they would engage in warfare. And so it really looks like ships were an important part of the development of this larger artillery. We don't have evidence for these things being developed in the Middle East. And we have a lot of, say, Neo-Assyrian. And Neo-Assyrians loved to depict themselves in about this time, besieging cities and destroying them utterly. But they never depicted artillery, large artillery. They had all sorts of other siege engines, but they didn't have artillery. And it may be because it was really just for putting on ships, and the Neo-Assyrians didn't do very much of that. So in his time, these bow-like things, these crossbow-like things, he turned them, or he had people turn them into big bow-like things. This is probably not entirely accurate, but it's you can imagine just dirty, great big crossbow on a ship shooting at other people. Almost, but not quite, something like this, of course. Put your thing in there, winch it back, and these aren't Syracusans, by the way, neither is he, and shoot it. Although it's probably kind of improbable that it could shoot this big steel thing with hooks on. It would more likely be a nice dart or something. So, crossbows carried on being a thing. This is actually a Roman crossbow. See, right here. And a quiver. Very nice. What they started getting into was a different type of engine. These are called torsion engines because they have torsion going on here. This is actually the driving force of this machine. And this is sort of made of hair, horse hair is one possibility, or even human hair, or sinew, something kind of springy. And so it's all weaved and plaited together here, you see, and making this cord, and there's a stick in it. Here's the stick. And so this is sort of like an elastic band. You can make these out of elastic band, and they're actually a lot of fun. As long as you don't hit someone in the eye with it, of course. But, and so this would be drawn back, you see. You have these long things here, you put that on here, wind it back, and this would get it caught. And then you would release it. This would shoot off and hopefully hit your adversary in the head. There are a lot of problems with these things, often called onagers. An onager, if you remember from our equid lectures, is a wild ass, a wild equid, which kicks and is wild and crazy. And that's what these things did, because that the problem with them is that all the power, all the energy is stored in the device. And so if you're like getting ready to shoot, you're winding it up and winding it up. This goes winding up, winding up, winding up. And if you don't shoot right away, all that power and energy is still in this torsion thing. And so until you release it, it can blow up in your face at any time. And it's just a matter of time before it will just actually break the machine and throw big chunks of wood in your face or wherever you happen to be. And then even when you shoot it, it goes bang, wang up into here. And you would actually have to have big cushions here to stop it snapping as it hit the crossbrace there. So it was a wild, crazy, violent, and somewhat dangerous thing to use. But if it meant it was be more dangerous for the other side, throwing rocks at their heads, then that was fine. So torsion engines are supposedly first recorded in 332 BC when Alexander was besieging Tyre in then Phoenicia. And so these were on the ships and they're recorded as being used at that time. And so this is kind of what's going on there. You see that? As pulling it back and releasing it. However, if you look carefully, these have rocks at the end. So these aren't torsion engines. We could use the term catapult. Catapult is one of many very confusing terms used for artillery in the ancient world. But this just has a heavy thing at the end. The heavy thing goes back down, and that throws whatever it is, the missile, up and at your adversary. And of course, no one ever made these. I have no knowledge of anything like this ever being made deliberately, except for making movies. And so I actually would question that this would work at all. And certainly would not throw a big rock as far as they did in this movie, which I shall leave unmentioned for copyright purposes. So that's sort of like the Greek story, which seems to largely hold water. But again, this is history, and you know what I've said about history in the past. But here's some more history. So this is where I've actually written down torsion. These are all torsion engines. Pliny the Elder, I don't know if you remember Pliny the Elder, he died at Pompeii, 79 AD when he died. But before he died, he wrote about all sorts of things, and one of them was about artillery. He was actually a naval officer and was very knowledgeable of these things, which were a big thing on the decks of the Roman ships, as you saw from that picture. And so he's using all sorts of different terms here. The scorpion, he said, was invented by the Cretans. This is probably what he mean by a scorpion, which is maybe what he called by a scorpion. I thought something like this would be more like a scorpion, but it's thought that this is what a scorpion was like. And you can see it's a bow-like thing. You see it has these two limbs, but the limbs are fired through torsion. So here you can have those bands of elastic material, of sinew or hair, and so you pull back these limbs and fire it, and the torsion is what fires it, not the bending elasticity of the limbs of the bow itself. So that is possibly what he was talking about as a scorpion. The catapult, probably something like this. He said was invented by the Syrians, and yeah, so this is probably what he meant by catapult. Although I'd have to say scorpions tend to have one tail, and that goes shooting up. So it's very, I'm really not making up. People really don't know what they're talking about. And this is probably a ballista, and the ballista and the sling, which is not a siege engine, probably, was invented by the Phoenicians. And the thing about this is Cretans are big seagoing people, as are Phoenicians, and so are Syrians if they're like coastal Syrians, like Antakya and places like that, a bit further north than the people that the Greeks called and the Romans called Phoenicians. And so it's possible that it's actually these people that did invent these things, just as Pliny said they did, but we don't have much of a record of it because they didn't happen to write it down, and they didn't go around making massive reliefs of themselves shooting each other like the Assyrians did. So, someone developed these things and used them and shot at each other. So crossbows carried on as being a big thing in Europe. This is from the 11th century as a column capital in Toulouse in southern France. So this is a Mediterranean thing. And you can see he's pulling up the cord here to string charge the crossbow. He's got 2 bolts. And it's possible that these people are actually in hell. They're sort of naked and not very attractive and pulling funny faces. And this is a common thing you do to depict people in hell in this period. And this would be because in the 11th century it was thought that crossbows were the work of the devil. They were thought to be evil things that you shouldn't be doing. In fact, Richard the Lionheart, Richard I of England, who we know in a medieval context because he led one of the Crusades, was killed by a crossbow, and people thought that this was some sort of medieval version of karma because he was a great advocate of using crossbows for killing people with them. And so he was hoisted on his own petard, which is like a bit relevant later on. But crossbows became more popular in the late Middle Ages. In Europe, these are later things, so they had also things. This is a hook that goes around his waist, and he puts his foot in it, and he stands up, and that draws the crossbow. Here's his hook like. This guy has a cranacin, and the cranacin will draw back the bow and get it ready to be fired. So crossbows were a bit of a thing. But how they worked in a field battle was not that actually good. And so again, we're going to move out of the Middle East to look at the Battle of Crécy. Partly because, after all, I am English. But partly because it's also very interesting to see how crossbows work against bows. And so here you have the best crossbows of the time, probably, being pulled back here, being carried here and shot here. And here we have longbows, the English and Welsh longbow, really not very different from Mesolithic bows I have shown you in previous lectures, and they're shooting away. And so the problem in a battlefield situation is that it takes a long time to crank these things up. And so for the amount of time it takes one of these guys to crank this up, load it and shoot it, these guys could get a lot of arrows off because it's just thwack, thwack, thwack. As soon as you can load it, you shoot it. Especially if you consider they are trained to hit what they're aiming at, but when you're actually shooting at an army, you don't have to take a lot of time aiming. And so you can see there's lots of arrows in these crossbowmen, and these guys are actually going to win the battle. And so that's a problem with crossbow. If you're up in a castle and you're hiding behind battlements, remember the lecture about battlements and how you can hide behind them instead of standing on top of them like an idiot, then it works very well. But in a battlefield, they don't work so well. And since we're on the subject, I thought I found this on the internet, and I kind of like it. So there's the crossbowman, you see. There's bows, other guys, crossbowmen. I could watch this all day. I really could. So back to the big engines. We have, in the medieval period, the introduction of what is known as a trebuchet. And again, that's a good thing. We like to call it nowadays, and it is a word thrown at them in the past, along with a bunch of other words. But it's very difficult to be 100% certain that when they said a word, it was talking about the same thing we are thinking about. So, but in the literature nowadays, you would call this a trebuchet. And in fact, you call this a traction trebuchet, because the traction is created by these chaps. This illustration is very good for showing you this end, but you can't see this end very well. This is a 12th century Byzantine depiction. The Byzantines had traction trebuchets from about the 6th century. They were introduced from China. There's a lot of contact between Tang China and the Mediterranean at this time, and so there was, traction trebuchets were one of the ideas that went from one side to the other, and they carried on using them. Everybody picked it up in the West, and it was a big thing for throwing rocks at people you didn't like in their castles especially. And so what happens is there's a bull here, and someone should be holding it. Unfortunately, they don't seem to be here. And then these guys pull down. So if you remember that there are guys here pulling down, and when the guy here says pull, they pull. In fact, first they take up tension, and then he shouts pull, or she shouts pull. It happens, but here we don't see the guys. There's another illustration from northern France, but you can imagine underneath here are a bunch of guys or women pulling down on this trebuchet, this traction trebuchet. And so this guy is the guy shooting it, and so he will hold on to the missile or the bag, or possibly like this one, he's got some sort of string going down, a rope going down here, and he's hanging on for dear life. And you can see it's lifting him up, because this is just that moment when he said pull, and they're all pulling down with all their might, and it's shooting up, and he's just following up just for a bit, and then lets it go, and boom, it's off, and will hopefully hit what you're aiming at. And as you know from an early lecture, I don't like to be too specific about genders, but I keep saying, even though we see men being depicted here, about women. And this is because in medieval sieges, a lot of women actually defended castles. Castles were, and this is in the Middle East as well as anywhere else where there were castles. Castles are used by a few people to control a large part of land, large bit of land. And so the army may be off doing something else, but the castle is there to control that land. And so what would happen would be, if it's besieged, everybody is trying to defend that castle, because, everything bad happens if they get in, and so you will fight. And none of this wilting ladies. It would be women manning these things. Manning is not the right word. Operating these things. And so there are accounts of women pulling these things down and shooting these things. And so, yes, definitely, don't get too gender specific. So this is the next development in the trebuchet. This is the traction. This is the counterweight trebuchet. That was the traction one before. And this is quite interesting. It's Mongols. These are Mongols, and you can see they're dressed like Mongols, so that works quite well. Besieging what seems to be actually more Mongols. but never mind. And here we have the chap who's presumably operating this, and he looks like he's a Middle Easterner. He looks like he's an Arab or maybe a Persian, and he's actually operating it. And this is interesting because it's thought that the counterweight trebuchet, here's the weight you see, was actually invented in the Middle East. So it was first described by this chap, Marty ibn al-Tarsusi, from Tarsus, one would assume, who wrote a treatise for Salah ad-Din in 1187, in which he clearly describes a counterweight trebuchet. And you've seen this little graphic before, which I made this, so I like to show it as often as possible, of a trebuchet being shot. Kind of cool. I'll do it again. Here we go. So again, I showed this to you when we were talking about castle architecture and how this would go down, the weight, and this would go around, go up. And of course, if you look at it, and I imagine also a torsion, a traction trebuchet, there are no torsion trebuchets, are actually very stable. A traction trebuchet especially, because nothing happens till people start pulling ropes. And this is also quite stable. It's just a heavy weight up here. Not doing anything particularly unpleasant as long as everything's strong enough to keep it up. There's no power here. There's no energy like there is in a torsion machine. This is not going to blow up and shoot splinters of wood into you. It's going to stay there until you release it. And you release it and it will go. And if you miss, you might want to add some weight or reduce the weight or change the ball. Make the ball larger or smaller. And so these changes, and also you can change the angle of the hook where one of these ropes is attached. So this will change where you're aiming, and because this is reliant on weight, not the people pulling down on it, like a traction trebuchet, it will be perfectly accurate. It will hit the same spot. Once you work out where you're shooting, then everything will work perfectly to put that rock precisely where you want it to be. That is why you see these big round balls all over the Middle Eastern castles, because these would have been for these counterweight trebuchets. They would carve these balls and they would know exactly the right size. See, there's a small one up here and here's a big one up here. You might remember my team from the 2006 season not getting out of the way when I'm trying to photograph these trebuchet balls, which of course is very different from this. So these guys have trebuchets, and they should be shooting beautiful round balls at these unattractive adversaries, and they're shooting big chunks of architecture. And it's utterly insane. And they have these beautiful trebuchets, and they're shooting chunks of architecture. It's insane. So that brings us finally to gunpowder. So gunpowder is made of sulfur, charcoal, and potassium nitrate, also known as saltpeter. So that's sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter. So this is a potassium, nitrogen, and oxygen bad time about to happen. So this was invented in China. It came from research in the 9th century into the elixir of life. Turned into the elixir of death, of course. By the 10th century, they realized they could blow things up with this stuff. And so in China, they had these explosive projectiles. So they could throw these at people or use artillery to shoot them at people and put a little wick in it and it will blow up. These are from the Takashima shipwreck, dated to the Mongol, the attempted invasion of Japan by the Mongols in about 1274, 1281. And so these are basically grenades or bombs. By the 13th century, they had developed cannon. And so, this is pretty much a Chinese idea at the beginning. In the Middle East, we have this historical reference, Hassan al-Rama, 1240 to 1280 or so, who attributes his material to his father and forefathers, so maybe a bit earlier. But we also have things like this, which seemed also to be bombs or grenades. And I may have referred to them earlier about in the ceramics, they are actually stoneware. And so for a Middle Eastern ceramic, it's a very unusually thick and highly fired ceramic. And so it seems to me that these have a very important function. And so we made replicas. This is an original, and this is a replica, and blew them up on Scarborough Beach to see if they broke in the same way as the originals, and they did. And so I think that's good evidence. And these actually can go back to like the 10th century. And so they were used from about the 10th century up until, say, 13th, 14th century, when guns start becoming more important, and they seem to go out of fashion. And here we are blowing up these watermelon. So one of the pivotal events involving gunpowder was the final fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1451, in which they used quite a lot of artillery. This is the Dardanelles gun, as it's known, made 1464, actually afterwards. Has a 63 centimeter bore, so it's huge, and it's a big can. So gunpowder was a big thing in Europe. This man called Roger Bacon wrote a very important thesis about it in 1267. And in 1326 you have Otto de Melemet, who wrote a very important treatise, and this is an early European canon, very early. In the 14th century they invented wet grinding of the components of gunpowder, which led to the safest and most productive way of making gunpowder. It was called corning because it made the gunpowder, and of course grinding it wet is a good idea anyway because it's far less likely to blow up, but it ended up making into these little corns, little lumps of gunpowder, which made it much better for blowing things up. So as these developed, gunpowder got more reliable, making guns became more reliable, until handguns became a more likely thing to be seen on a battlefield. And so you remember crossbows. So crossbows took a long time to load, took a long time to shoot, but they're very easy to aim. And so then guns come along, and as you can see by the way this man is firing it, he's looking down this very long barrel, and the ball is going to go in that direction. The missile is going to go in that direction. And so these are dead easy to shoot. You could quite easily learn how to shoot one of these and hit your target very easily. Not like a bow and arrow, so you don't need to spend so much time training. It takes some training to know how to shoot a gun, especially when it involves messing around with gunpowder, but it became a big thing. It took a while to load it and everything, but it had other advantages that certainly crossbows didn't have. It created a lot of damage. This is a bullet being shot through a lump of gelatin. And you can see it's not just like you have this sharp projectile going through someone's body. If you remember from the lecture about archery, about arrowheads and how they're designed to go into a body and cut through arteries. They could miss arteries entirely if you're really lucky or unlucky, depending whether you're receiving it or shooting somebody with it, and not do all that cutting. And even if they do cut a lot of arteries, it will take a while to bleed out. It's very seldom that one arrow will immediately kill somebody, what it's more likely is it's going to make them incapable of defending themselves effectively from another attack. Certainly, you get an arrow in the face, it's a very bad deal. But a lot of arrows will just be sticking in people and slowing them down, and somebody comes along and hits them with something. But a bullet fired from a gun is not like that. It's flying at very high speed, and explodes. The power of it explodes on impact. And it's also, of course, it's just got blown up, so it's red hot. So you have this red hot lump of lead slamming into something, into a person or a slab of gelatin, and you can see the heat inside here and being expelled. It explodes. That is from this being very, very hot. And so, as you can imagine, this is deadly. It's not like you can get an arrow in the arm and live. This would probably like shatter your arm and you have to have it cut off. Get it in the stomach, you will just die. Get it in the chest and you're already dead before you even know you've been shot, possibly. So this is the end of valiance. Valiance is more than bravery. Being valiant is to stand up in front of all of your enemies and say and taunt them and say, "Come on then," because if you say "come on then" in a battlefield with guns, someone will just shoot you and you'd be dead and it will be over. And no matter how much armor you're wearing, and you can wear a certain amount of armor, and people did try and develop armor that could resist these bullets, but it is very, very heavy and very thick and not very effective, and so people stopped wearing armor. And it was basically the death of chivalry, the death of the Middle Ages, an era which started with the development of the stirrup, probably, and lots of people running around on horses with stirrups, and lots of armor, lots of elitism. A lot of money went into the armor and the weapons and the horses, and so these had to be the leaders of society. These had to be the great leaders. But when guns came along, they would just shoot you dead. And so the leaders of society stopped being heroes at the forefront of a battle and turned into the grey men, hiding somewhere at the back, sending all the young men off to die. And that was the beginning of the modern world, which is the end of the archaeology of stuff. Thank you.